Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, the US state of hate. Why and how are hundreds of hate groups operating in the United States? Some of the very best shows we have here on the stream are because you suggest them. That really is the case for today's show, today's conversation. Yeah. Can you take us back to how we got to this place, Malika?
Well, the idea for this came from our community, as you mentioned. This is Warden on Facebook. He wrote to us after the shootings in Charleston. We did a show on that. So Warden then writes, I believe that groups like the KKK secretly exist. The question is, how did they come to exist and what are their motives? So we'll be talking about groups like that. We want your questions, just like Wardens here. You can tweet us with hashtag AJStream.
Now, the stream is only as powerful as your participation, so jump right in. Let me show you one way you can do that. I'm at stream.aljazeera.com. We have a little widget here which allows you to record your video comments. So you're watching this show right now, you want to add a video comment, you want to show us your opinion with us, you can do it by being right here in the stream.
Peterson, the editor and owner of reshaping.com. I'm a writer, an activist, a blogger, a social media enthusiast, a gamer geek, and I'm in the stream.
Grief and hope are pouring out of a historic black church in the southern United States. That's where President Barack Obama last week sang Amazing Grace during the funeral of the church's pastor, one of 9 people murdered in a Bible study class by a young white man.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
That song is a hymn of redemption written by a former slave trader more than 200 years ago. President Obama's eulogy was a stand against hate and racism in a country struggling with both. President Obama's very existence, the first African-American leader of the United States, has fired up hate groups. Nearly 800 of them are currently operating across the country, with more than half identifying as white nationalists, and that comes according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. Some members say blacks and immigrants are taking away jobs and education opportunities, and that the media is covering up black on white crime. With white people on track to be a minority in the US in 30 years, that fear runs deep. Joining us to talk about this, we have here in the studio DARYL Johnson, former US government counter-terrorism analyst and author of Right-Wing Resurgence. Sitting next to DARYL, we have Frank Meink, former neo-Nazi skinhead and author of Autobiography of a Recovering Skinhead. And in Portland, Oregon, Randy BLAZAK is a sociologist and author of Teenage Renegades, Suburban Outlaws. Gentlemen, it's good to have you here in the stream. We're going to try and unpack this phenomenon that's been going on for quite a while here in the US. So Frank, if I was trying to work out, what is it that somebody who's a racist then motivates them to do something incredibly violent? How do you make sense of that? Well,
first, to make sense of it, I'd have to put you in that situation. So, you know, say you hate a neighbor. There's a neighbor who always plays loud music, and it just, every time you're around and you hear him playing it, you get upset. Sure. It's my home. I don't want to hear this, okay? And so now every time you see that person, you feel this feeling of, I don't like this guy. It's bothering you. Right. Everyone has that in their life. Sure. Every human being. Yeah. Now, times that by 100 and think about waking up every day and that's your first thought. That's how we are. That's my first, I wake up, the first thing I think about is how can I save the white race, as we would put it, but more or less, how is my hate still filled and fueled today? And that's how I woke up.
The very first thing.
First thought.
And you know, there's an added component to that that really magnifies it even more, which is this kind of apocalyptic view that everything is changing and it's changing too quickly, and the picture of America is being taken away from the white people. And if they don't do something now, if they don't act now, the vision they have of the world as they see it is going to be gone. So there's this incredible historic pressure to act now. And that takes that situation that Frank is talking about and then elevates it to another level, because there's the impetus. If I don't do it now, maybe it'll be too late 30 years from now.
Daryl, I mean, you spent a long time looking at domestic terrorism in the United States. So you were studying individuals, you were studying groups. Do you come to the same kind of conclusion that Frank and Randy did about first thought, first thing you wake up in the morning, it completely takes over your thinking?
Well, yeah, I mean, these people have a belief system that they adhere to. I mean, I attribute it to personal life experiences. Each one of these terrorists that we have, if you go back in time and look at their lives, they've had some sort of event that caused them to seek new truths. And that is that opportunity that exposed them to extremism that they later embraced as the new truth.
Can you give us an example, one that we will know internationally?
Well, sure. Let's talk about Dylann Roof for a minute. Going back over his life, supposedly there was a girl that he was infatuated with and wanted to, have a relationship with. This girl later basically ditched him for a black man, and this was that cataclysmic event in his life that caused him to start seeking out new truths and exposed him to extremism and the white nationalist message.
Right.
And what did he say when he shot the church? When he was shooting in the church, he said, "You're taking our women. You're taking our country."
Wow.
Right.
So there you have it. In his own words, he's personalizing the message through his own personal life experience that sent him on that path.
So Frank, you heard Daryl talk about an event. We have a couple questions that I'm going to pose to you from our community. This is Mr. Will Bill. He says, who taught you to hate? There's always a starting point on a path. And then related to that, there's this question from Martin who says, I guess whether or not a personal or family problems influences that direction and more importantly, factors in most into that decision or that mindset. So is it one thing that necessarily teaches someone or where does that mindset even come from?
Well, I mean, you're definitely at a bottom in life when things, when you start to come to some of these groups. And where I was, I changed schools, so I was going from a school that was pretty diverse in Philadelphia to an almost all-black school in West Philadelphia, where I was picked on because of my race. I mean, it's just a fact that that's what happened at that school.
What did they say to you? Or they just picked on you because you were different?
Well, there was a lot of bullying at that school, but it was definitely, there was only maybe 20 white males that went to that school, so we were definitely some of the victims of the bullying because there's bigger, but there was also black kids that got picked on too. I mean, it was a rough school.
Right.
So, but to me, I don't see that at 13 years old. All I know is who's causing me pain, who's causing me anguish in my life, and so already I'm hating home. I have some drug addicts in my life that were taking care of me. Now when I go to school, I'm getting it worse because now I'm fist fighting with these kids. So that summer, I went up to go hang with a cousin who I thought was really cool. You know, you have the older siblings who everyone, you just look up to them. Yeah. And he was part of this group, and it was just the perfect storm, to use that analogy in a way. Yeah. Here I'm going through all this. My cousin belongs to this group. Where he lives, where no black people live, but he hates black people. And that's where I first got turned on to. The reason why this is happening in my life is because I'm white and I'm persecuted. And at the time, it seemed like it fit and agreed with what was going on in my life.
You asked the question how people get introduced to these beliefs. It's through a variety of means. And I've seen that change quite a bit over the decades that I've looked at this problem. What used to be a very intimate face-to-face interaction is now gone onto the internet through social media. And so you have people like Dylann Roof, who doesn't necessarily have to go to a KKK cross-burning or go to a neo-Nazi skinhead-sponsored barbecue. He could just go on the internet and find these beliefs and become indoctrinated through the anonymity of the internet. So what used to be a very personal, intimate face-to-face interaction between a friend, a neighbor, a family member who belonged to the Ku Klux Klan is now through the messaging of the internet.
Do you not have to then have? Yeah, go ahead, Randy. Go ahead.
I was going to say that's absolutely right, and Frank's story is very instructive because we see young people as seekers, trying to understand both their own experience and how the world works. And when we're young, we see the world in kind of very simplistic black and white terms. And if somebody comes along, whether it's coming to me personally, including a family member, or I find it on the website, that gives me a paradigm, a way to explain not only the personal, why this girl won't go out with me, but the larger, why jobs are disappearing or why I see more black and gay faces on TV. They give me this sort of analysis, and it's like a drug. I just plug into it. Here's this one thing, this one magic pill that explains everything. Give me more. How
did that make your life better, Frank? Because, I mean, you created mayhem when you were a skinhead. You beat people up because you didn't like the way they looked. Yeah,
we fought a lot. Violence is a main part of our...
And you were a leader. Yeah. How does that make you feel better? How does that make your family life better?
How it made me feel better was, you have to know that I'm an egomaniac with no self-esteem in my life. So you can
give me 2 examples of that, because that feels like 2 very strange opposites.
And it absolutely is, and that's what drives people like me to do violent things and to what happens.
And is that do you think that's typical of other people who are in your situation, or is that just you?
No, you have to be that way. That's kind of the way you survive in this. See, because I can put violence on the world and not think much about it, because again, I lost my empathy for the world. I lost humanity. And I didn't lose it, and this is from a great quote from another former. I gave up my humanity for acceptance into this group. I gave it all up.
Right.
And see, I'll give you an example. When they would talk about Jews, I didn't know nothing about Jews growing up in South Philadelphia. There's no Jews in my neighborhood. But I remember I would hear uncles and cousins and family members and friends and good people, I would think, in my life who would say in a money deal, hey, don't Jew me. I never got that when I was a kid. I didn't get that joke.
Yeah.
I didn't get the how do you start a Jewish prayer, you roll a penny down the street. I didn't get that.
So you're hating people that you have actually no contact with.
Right.
You just hate those people over there.
So what happened when I would hear these movements talk about the groups, they would talk about Israel and the Jews and siphoning off money off of America, it unlocked what the adults in my life had always joked and said, don't Jew me. So now I know what the adults know, and I want to know what they know. I want to be able to, they left me to fend for myself. So now I want to know what the adults know, and I want to be able to debate with them. I want to be able to prove them wrong.
Malika?
And I want to add also that
Randy.
Frank's choices, the choices that Frank made during this period made him kind of a rock star. I mean, he had a certain celebrity status. When I was doing my research in the early 90s, I was in Chicago talking to skinheads, and I said, oh, you need to go to Philadelphia and talk to Frankie Mink. He really is the big guy on that part of the country. And so there's also, you talk about
he was an example of
self-esteem.
he was an example of someone you need to go research before.
Right, because he, and I'm sure that had an impact on him in terms of his low self-esteem. Now he has this almost celebrity status in that small subculture.
Yeah. Gentlemen, let me just bring in the community as well. Malika?
Well, some of them are talking about how we see this recruitment growing. This is one idea from Leah. She says historically, periods of extreme wealth inequality feature surges of political, racist, and religious extremism. And that's echoed in this video comment, Daryl. I want you to have a listen to what Rachel told to stream.
I think many white supremacists' anxieties around race is interlinked to economic inequalities. Whether they'd like to admit it or not, there is far more in common between poor whites and poor blacks than there is between rich and poor white people. This just highlights a failure to address wider, persistent socioeconomic inequalities that transcend the boundaries of race.
So she talked about economic inequalities feeding into this. Did the recession play a role? And also, I think it begs the question, did the election of an African-American president also expose some of these rifts? Was that a combined thing?
Yeah, in my report that I wrote in 2009, it was later leaked, those were some of the major factors that we attributed this resurgence in right-wing extremism. So as a combination of having an African-American president win the election, which was pretty much the nightmare scenario for most white nationalists, led to a huge recruitment boom for them. But also, as Rachel pointed out, the economy does play a role. We saw it with sovereign citizen movement, how the financially vulnerable grasped onto that movement to try to give an easy explanation or a legal.
Tell us a little bit about sovereign citizen movement.
Sovereign citizens are people that reject government authority and want to absolve themselves of any type of roles as being a citizen. So you can see how someone that's financially vulnerable, who's getting ready to lose their house, will pay hundreds of dollars for a pseudo-legal kit to try to forestall the foreclosure process. But among white nationalists, particularly unemployment seems to be an issue that resonates with them. And the fact that you have people that lose their jobs, especially if they go overseas, the foreign outsourcing of jobs, those are themes that resonate with white nationalists and give them a scapegoat to blame their personal problems on.
Sure. Frank, in your work, you're looking and trying to help people get out of their current mindset. How do you find them?
A lot of people reach out to me, family members, brothers, sisters, even friends, and sometimes the person themselves will reach out and say, I'm thinking about this. And so what I do is I make sure that I don't go and put them down more. See, because everyone else in their life says, oh, you're so stupid for believing that stuff. You're so dumb. That's what they've heard their whole life. They don't need to hear that. What they need to hear is, I understand why you believe that way. Here's how I can prove that theory wrong to you. And usually I can go down the whole gamut of whatever their theory is in the white nationalist movement.
We talked
but
about
they're still human beings.
Yeah.
You mean they are still human beings.
800 groups that we've been able to sort of track right now. Who knows how many they are?
Or how many that are in them. Too.
Yeah.
Because you could be two guys.
How do you?
Go to the website.
Well,
the one-man clan.
This is true. Randy, how do you track them down? I mean, I know you've gone undercover at some point. How do you find out who they are? Because maybe that's part of the way to working out how do we move past this.
Sure. I mean, they're open door to someone who looks like Frank and I. They certainly want new recruits all the time. So it's relatively easy to gain access. But, you know, I think the larger conversation is, even though there was a big spike in hate groups in 2000, really around the immigration debate, and then in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama, we've seen a drop-off in the last few years. And I think that's because the former groups like the Klan and the skinheads are becoming a bit passé, because, like Dylan Roof's case, you don't really have to join a group anymore to participate in this larger counterculture. You just log online to one of the white supremacist websites. And so that makes it even more difficult to try to get an eye of how many people are actually involved in these groups, because it's really an online world no more. It's not going to the Klan rally down the street and counting heads.
Yeah.
It's now trying to get an idea of how many people have this sort of tangential relationship. It's like this weird Venn diagram that some people are sometimes on these websites and sometimes not. And so it's really difficult now to figure that question out.
One quantitative measure that we had at Department of Homeland Security is we monitored some of the public websites. One of the most prominent white supremacy, white nationalist websites is stormfront.org. It's been around since the advent of the internet. It existed as a message board before the internet even came to be. But we saw the number of registered users leading up to the election in 2008 go from around 80,000 registered users, and then in one day, the day after the election on November 5th, 2008, surged by nearly 3,000 registered new users. And then now we have over 300,000 plus registered users on Stormfront. So that's, you know,
we just tried to get
just
online
one
and we couldn't get online.
quantitative measure that you could use is people registering for the most prominent white nationalist website on the internet. Now that is international, so there may be people from, you know, overseas that have joined that, but still, that's quite a leap.
And some of those people may be researchers studying them, because I'm also a researcher.
Randy's on there all the time.
Every research is like, thanks, Daryl, I'm just going to write that down. Malika.
Well, I think it's interesting that you noted that. This is just one comment from Bill, who says, focusing on one country is hateful since groups in the U.S. often model themselves with groups abroad. But I want to shift this a little bit here. And Randy, go to this tweet from Christian. He is talking about tackling white supremacy, and he says it's doubtful that we'll be able to, because seriously tackling supremacy would require asking uncomfortable questions about mainstream U.S. culture. And so that's linking a lot of things here, but I know that you do just this. You ask these uncomfortable questions. There's one that I'm thinking of in my mind about talking about peanut butter, talking about TV shows. Can you explain to our audience?
Right. Well, I was invited to talk to some high school kids, including a class that had a couple of skinheads in it, and there was a lunch break, and I noticed that the two skinheads, one was eating bagels and the other was eating peanut butter, and I stopped them and I said, "You guys are the worst Nazis I've ever seen." And bagels are Jewish food, and peanut butter was invented by George Washington Carver, who's black. If you want to be good Nazis, you should eat sauerkraut or waffles or some Northern European food. And one of those kids, I always leave with my phone number and my email contacted me later, and he said, "You know, I've really been thinking about all the things you talked about, because there was many things we discussed, including music, and I really want to have more conversations about this world and maybe some of the bad choices I've made." And I said, "You know, what was it that really stuck with you?" And he said, "It was the thing about peanut butter. I don't want to give it up." And I thought, well, you know, here we go. Here's the avenue out. And I think that's a part of a larger conversation about how we really are stronger because
Randy,
of our diversity
in
this country.
Right.
16 years old.
Right, okay.
And that adds to a little bit of what Randy's saying is the whole movement actually is a big bait and switch. And for a bait and switch event, you know, you're told you're going to get this, but when you get into it, you're not getting that. I'm told that I'm going to become part of this group and be proud to be white. And Randy, and I'm sure you guys get to, not once in a rally or a meeting did I ever hear once about being proud to be white. I only heard about, look at what they're doing. Look at what they are doing. It's always about what the other person's doing. It's not about, oh, we should be proud of our heritage because we did this. And I mean, I might have heard that maybe 1% of a meeting. It's always, so you're not really proud to be the race of your color.
See Daryl, you did a lot of research. You still do research into this whole area of hate crimes, hate groups individuals. What's the research for? If we don't use the research, how do we get out of this situation we are in the US right now?
Well, part of the thing I'm trying to do is to educate the public on the issues. There's a lot of bad information out there, and there's a lot of people that are shirking their responsibilities in Washington. I'm talking about our conservative leaders. But getting the message out, calling it what it is, developing, a counter-messaging strategy. We just had a summit in Washington, D.C. in February. The president called it, and we had international leaders come together. White nationalism was not discussed. It was all about countering ISIS's message.
Yes, I remember that. Yes.
We need to include these other
Yeah.
domestic, non-Islamic groups and movements and counter their message as well.
Melika.
Well, Frank, when we talk about getting the message out that Daryl just mentioned, there's this tweet from Arthur. He writes in, what was the defining moment that transformed you to a man, he says, that can reason logically and denounce racial hatred?
Well, it isn't an overnight change. I would question anybody that, oh, I'm done. It was consistently people coming into my life and proving the theories wrong to me, but not by jamming it down my throat, just becoming a human being with me, having empathy with me, sharing your experience. All these things were kind of happening within the end of my time in the movement. And then finally, one of the last things was a Jewish man gives me a job at an antique place in
And you
Philadelphia.
just come out of prison?
Just came out of prison, had a big swastika tattooed on my neck.
Where is it, by the way?
It's laser surgery off now.
Oh, okay.
Or your makeup people did a good job.
Yeah.
But no, it's laser surgery off.
Right.
This Jewish man gave me a job, and it was already like the last straw. I'd already come down to all the conclusions that most of what I'm hearing isn't matching up right with the white supremacists.
Yeah.
But the Jewish thing actually could stay in me because I didn't know any Jewish people. I had no empathy yet.
So you still hated Jewish people, and a Jewish man gave you a job.
And he gives me a job, and he winds up like showing me all about the antique business, and just was this amazing human being in my life. And he knew that I was a neo-Nazi.
Right.
So he keeps going, I don't care, just don't break my furniture. He's just this great human being.
I want to show you something here. It's off your Twitter page, so I'm just going to go back here.
Off my Twitter page?
Yeah, let me just yes, it's okay. My boy Frankie, a reformed neo-Nazi skinhead, brought me flowers. He is cured. Let me just scroll down here. So cure's possible?
A cure, absolutely a cure is possible.
Yeah?
And it's when you start to learn this, there's a complete breakaway eventually. There really is a complete breakaway.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of us out there that do this. There's TJ Lydon, there's Christian up in Chicago, and there's a whole group of Life After Hate over all these people who've gotten out and really got out.
See, I'd rather end on that than end on this, but I'm going to click over here anyway. Hate groups are descending on Charleston and they're armed. And then here, another headline, string of nightmare fires hit predominantly black churches in 4 southern states. This is after those people were gunned down in a church, Randy. What's up with America?
Well, I mean, the good news is in general, hate crimes are on the decline and hate groups are on the decline. But the bad news is that the people who feel that their voice is not being heard in this racial discussion that we're having in America are getting more and more frustrated and more extreme. And I think that's what we're seeing is the smaller and smaller group is just becoming more and more agitated, and therefore there's a greater potential of violence from them.
Right.
Whenever there's any type of racial division in a community, white supremacists will attempt to hijack the conversation or assert themselves into the conversation to force that division even wider or to try to validate whatever preconceived notions that they have. So we've seen this in Jasper, Texas, when James Byrd was dragged at the back of a pickup truck. We had the Ku Klux Klan come down there and hold rallies. We've seen the Ferguson riots, how the KKK attempted to go in and try to insert themselves into that, and someone had burned down the church.
An opportunity, just a little sliver of an opportunity. So you're listening there to Daryl Johnson. We also have Randy BLAZAK and Frank Meink. We're going to be talking about hate groups, hate crime in America. If you have a question for them, #AJStream. We're waiting for your conversation at stream.outerzero.com. Thanks for watching. See you online. Hello again, welcome to the Streams Online Post Show. We're talking about US hate groups. Going to start first with Malika. I'm really interested in what the community is talking about right now.
Well, of course, since we have an international community, so many people are saying, why don't you just ban these groups? Why don't you make their speech illegal, jail them, prosecute them? This is from Kabuli, though, and I'll direct this one to you, Daryl. He says, banning them to speak is like pretending that they don't exist. Debating may help some to change. So for our international audience, of course, the First Amendment means we can't just ban speech, but what do you make of this distinction that banning them anyway would then just mean that we're ignoring the fact that they're there?
Yeah, so, obviously we have constitutional protections. People can say, pretty much anything that they want as long as it's not threatening to another individual. So we have to be very careful with that and very delicate balance between what law enforcement does against these groups and protecting people's constitutional rights. But I agree. I think that by not talking about it, we're basically allowing the problem to fester or to grow. And so by engaging it and having conversation about it, it brings additional attention to it, and hopefully we can curb it.
What's interesting is that you talked about some of these people being terrorists. Yep. Did you think you were a terrorist, Frank?
No, no one ever thinks you think you're a freedom fighter. It's the difference. You're either a freedom, for one side you're a freedom fighter, the other side you're a terrorist. Yeah. That's how this thing goes.
And from the government's point of view, I mean, we were looking at only those in the white nationalist movement that had, some criminality, right, violent talk, threats, or people that get desperate and actually plot acts of terrorism.
Yeah. I'm wondering whether, because you mentioned this with the White House gathering, which was looking at domestic terrorism, but really looking at it from a sort of, okay, maybe domestic terrorists are going to be terrorists who are radicalized by Al-Qaeda, for instance. They weren't looking at maybe a broader sense of what a terrorist is. Is that perhaps the issue here, is that Dylann Roof can be a lone wolf, but if Dylann Roof was called, I don't know, Mohammed perhaps, then the whole vibe of the conversation would be totally different and people would be freaking out.
Right, and that's what's going back to my main point, educating the public and having our national leadership and media come out and call things what it is.
Yeah.
To simply dismiss this as an act of a crazed gunman or someone that's mentally ill or someone that did not belong to a group, those are just all false, have nothing to do with terrorism at all, and are just meant to mislead and to misguide people.
And this is also part of those uncomfortable conversations that we need to have. People don't want to see a terrorist that looks like them, so he must be a crazy person. But we do, in fact, have Christian terrorists and white terrorists and conservative terrorists and right-wing terrorists. And there is this ease by which Muslim terrorist rolls off the tongue, even in the media in the United States. But to refer to people on the right element of the political spectrum, including Christian groups like the Ku Klux Klan, as terrorism is almost like really going too far for a lot of people, including in the mainstream media. And it's frustrating because that's exactly what they are.
And with that, the mainstream media, think about it, we couldn't even talk honestly about this when it happened. Fox News said it was a guy did it because they were Christians. So we can't even have a real like everyone has to take their little part, because let's not look at our side of this. Let's only, look at, it's a war against us, right? It still divides us and it keeps us going and it keeps people listening. But we couldn't even have the conversation from the get-go. And it's just like when we talk about—
Are we doomed then? I mean, you've got, I don't want to give away all your ages, but Daryl, you've been doing this for decades.
20 years.
You've been doing it for a couple of decades. Randy, you've been doing this for 30 years. Is America doomed? Is this always going to be a little tiny bit of America?
We're going to be doomed if we don't come to terms with it and start addressing the issue. If you sit there and try to dismiss these things as not being terrorism, then we can't get national focus on it. We can't understand the scope of the problem. We can't develop strategies to counter it.
Yeah.
Well, when you talk about strategies in countering it, I just want to jump in with this because Daryl was talking about strategies to counter this. This is Davey on Twitter. He says, maybe we should revisit whatever measures were used to fight Black Panthers and start applying them to these groups. So do we see the same kind of tactics with the government, informants, wiretapping, raids that we saw with the Black Panthers?
Well, those are definitely tools that the government uses to infiltrate and expose some of the more violent plots. But I think what's happened is because our government's resources are limited and because 9/11 was such a horrific terrorist attack, our counterterrorism leaders and strategists have developed this, well, let's just prevent the big one. Let's prevent the mass casualty producing attack. Let's put all of our resources against that threat, and it comes at a cost and at an expense. And that is that these domestic terrorists.
The new approach is this notion of a leaderless resistance. These are the lone wolves. So it's not like, you know, when the government went after the Klan in the 20s and you just go after the leadership and the whole thing comes down, or it goes after the Black Panthers in the 1960s. You now have all these sort of like-minded individuals who kind of cohabitate on the internet, have a similar agenda, a similar rationale of looking at the world, but there's no one hierarchy to go after for the government to focus on. It's sort of like you go after these people over here and there's 3 more on the other side. So it's much more difficult in terms of the policing, and I agree they, you know, really focus on the big ticket items, but the Dylan Roofs are completely off the radar.
See, gentlemen, in our editorial meeting before this show, we had a conversation, and I, despite my profession, intrinsically think that people are good people. Most people are good people, and that this niggling thing about hate groups, hate crime in America is not the way the majority of white people think. Let me just play you this. This is my belief, but you can shake me in my belief if you want. I want to play you this a little bit. This is Matthew Heimbach. He is the leader of the White Student Union. Have a listen to how he's thinking about America.
Politics that don't work. Again, tax cuts for billionaires do not work. We need to speak to our base. We don't need to discriminate against anyone else, but we need to acknowledge that white people in this country, we first of all exist. Second of all, we have legitimate interests. And third of all, there are programs such as affirmative action that discriminate against us. When Martin Luther King...
So this is Randy, a young man who feels that white people are being discriminated against. So here's me thinking, oh, it's just a small group, it's not a big thing. Is this a big thing in America? Is America having a race meltdown right now?
Well, it's a bit generational. I mean, there is a new generation, Generation Y, the kids that were born after 1980 that kind of see these problems as solved. They see racism as solved. We have a black president. Homophobia is solved. Sexism is solved. Why are we still dealing with these things, and aren't we being made to feel guilty? I mean, there's a big element of ignorance. I mean, this guy has no idea how affirmative action works or the historical context by which we tackle these issues. So, I mean, I think if we were to talk to this young man 10 years from now, he might be sitting, you know, beside Frank and talking about all the stupid things that he believed in and said when he was
but as Frank said, it's not stupid. You have to have empathy, Randy. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to have him on the program. Malika.
Well, picking up on the question that you asked, Femi, this is JJ. He disagrees. I don't think he sees as much goodness as you do in people. JJ says it's mainstream racism, not the far right, that gives the far right belief in action. And it's when things like politicians call black people thugs. So it's these little microaggressions, I guess you could call them, that lead to this bigger phenomenon. What would you say to that idea?
I mean, it's the absolute truth. I mean, we want to talk about real racism. I mean, we should talk about, you know, the incarceration rates and the private prison industries and all that. That's where, you know, real breaking the foundation of families up is, you know, putting people in prison for financial reasons is ridiculous, and we have that in this country. And when you have there are more African-American, more black people in prison right now than there were slaves at one time. How crazy is that? And we live it, and we just say, oh, it's, you know, look at the thugs in Southside Chicago. See, that's the big fear.
Yikes.
Right? Look, in every place where these groups thrive.
But we also have a bigger population, Frank, as well. There are more Americans here than ever before.
But it's
still a lot.
It's still a lot. It's still a ridiculous amount of people to be incarcerated.
Yeah.
So, but listen, most of these hate groups will thrive right outside of major cities, right? Look, up North Michigan right now. There's a couple big groups coming up there. Why? Because they get the Detroit news and they see what's going on in Detroit and they say, I don't want that. They're going to come for my women. Okay? Same thing, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania used to be a huge hate state. Why? Because the two major cities, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, their news feeds into the very rural areas, and all the kids see it, and the parents say, that's why we don't go down there, because look at those so-and-sos, right? That's where it starts to form. It starts to form when your parents and people around you start to say, don't Jew me. And that's where we have to have the conversation.
Gentlemen, this is it has been a really uncomfortable conversation, but a really insightful one. So I have to say thank you so much to Daryl, to you, Frank, and also Randy as well for helping us have an uncomfortable conversation. I think if we had these more often, we'd be in a much better place. All right, I'm still an optimist. There are good people in America. I know there are. Malika, where do you want to leave us?
I will leave us with Shad, who reiterates what you just said. Thank you for your honesty to all three of our guests. It helps us understand the root cause.
All right, so tomorrow I'm not here. Malika Bilal will be here, the dream team of Malika and Omar. Talking about what?
We're talking about Cyprus, a topic we haven't covered too much on this stream. Will Cyprus be reunited? UN brokered talks are underway in that divided island. So we'll speak to Cypriots about what they think lies ahead for them.